Oh boy. Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. I've had a lot of viewers ask me, and as well as a lot of interesting comments I've seen around the internet, in relation to Finnish Mosins, right? Now, when we talk about Finnish Mosins, we know all sorts of crazy commentary is going to come up, and there's all sorts of stereotypes and interesting lore around these rifles, which is not always accurate. But what we're talking about today specifically is rarity. Now, y'all know this is a term I'm very hesitant to use when it comes to Mosins. But the question is why? Well, this gets kind of complicated and leads us down a really fun rabbit hole, which I'm going to do my best to avoid, but there's a conversation that we need to have about this, folks. Okay, well, to give you a little bit of background on this, in our current modern day, I would say our society has sort of become a postmodernist society, largely at least, in many places. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of problems with this, but especially one, though, I want to talk about in regards to truth. What is truth? Well, truth is absolute, right? Truth is a thing, okay? Now, some people will say that truth is one thing, and that might conflict with what I say truth is. So that kind of becomes a difficult problem to solve because we have absolute truth, we have objective truth, but then we also have subjective truth. There's the truth, which of course is Jesus Christ. He is truth. But then once we get down to man's corrupted level here on earth, we have all sorts of different perverted versions of truth. So some people's truth is different from other people's truth, even though above all that there is absolute truth. Okay, why are we talking about truth, absolutism versus relativism here? Well, when we talk about rarity with Mosins, this gets a little bit, well, complicated. You see, I tend to have a very different opinion of rarity than a lot of other people will have. Case in point, if you had $1 for every gun listed on Gunbroker right now, or say Mosin, listed right now on Gunbroker, with the word rare in the title, you'd probably have enough to go buy an M39 rifle like this one right here. Rare is extremely overused when we're talking about Mosins, okay? In the context of Mosins. And that's a part of that is because of this relativism of someone's opinion or someone's truth of what rarity is, isn't actually accurate when we look at the real definition of rare. Okay, so let's look at an example of what it is we're exactly talking about here. Well, let's say someone might say that this gun is rare, for instance, a Finnish M39. So how do we dissect that to figure out if what they're saying is actually true? Well, one thing we can look at is production numbers, right? So this is a 1943 Sacco M39, and they produced many thousands of these rifles. And this isn't a particularly rare rifle in my context, just from the fact that if you go on Gunbroker for over the course of like several months, you'll see many rifles just like this get posted, the same make, the same model, the same year. The stock may vary a little bit, the finish may vary a little bit, but overall it's pretty much the same gun. But I can't tell you how many times I see someone call a Mosin similar to this rare. Why is that? Well, it could be because, one, they just want to sell it, right? And it's sort of like the used car salesman ideology where you have to say whatever it takes to get a sale to make something more appealing. I get that. That's the way that capitalism works, right? That's just sort of one of the things we have to deal with here living on Earth, okay? Everyone's out to make some money, and they do what they want to, and if they have to twist the truth a little bit, they have to, and that's what they have to do. Okay, well, so that's some people's opinion, but some people don't even think they're twisting the truth. Some people actually believe these are rare, when maybe they aren't so rare when they're talking about Mosins. But if we look at production numbers, this can be a little bit conflicting, because on one hand you can say, well, they made thousands of these, and here in the US, if I wanted to buy a rifle just like this, I could fairly easily. If I went on Gunbroker right now, I could probably find a rifle just like this, and as long as I had enough money to buy it, well, I could get it with very little difficulty, honestly. But that's here in America. What about, let's say we go over the pond over to Europe, maybe the United Kingdom. Well, is this rifle rare in the United Kingdom? Well, the answer to that may be a little bit different than asking if this rifle's rare in the United States. This is where this also gets tricky, this conversation. So we have an absolute truth of what is rare, but the thing is, it could still have multiple meanings. So if we have an absolute truth that can still have multiple meanings, I think that absolute truth needs to be dissected into multiple different definitions or meanings. Okay, so there's an absolute rarity, to me, which is how many out there exist. How many do I have or potentially have ready access to? That might be a different question altogether. So if we look at Mosins, how many are produced across the world, it's something like, the number I always hear is something on the order of over 37 million. Now, right off the bat, you'd say, well, 37 million rifles, that automatically makes it impossible to be rare. Well, that's a fair point. But what we also have to understand with that, once we dissect that a little bit more, is we get into all these little nitty-gritty details of, is it this particular model, this particular manufacturer, this particular year, this particular marking, this particular condition, this particular country where it came from, this particular, the list goes on, where there's all these different little buckets, okay? And think of all the different little buckets that this guy fits into, a 1943 Sacco M39. Now, I might be apprehensive to call this gun rare, but let's say one of our viewers over the pond is looking at this. They might be saying, Big Sam, you're totally wrong. This is a rare rifle. If I would like to have one of these, but if I went out and tried to buy one right now, I couldn't. There's really no place that sells these. Okay, so there's a couple things with that. So number one is gun control. In Europe, it's actually a lot harder to get a gun than it is here in America. Now, we can kind of set some of that to the side, especially if what we're talking about is someone who already has all the licenses and done all of gone through all the loops and cut the red tape, whatever, to try to get to the point where they can actually buy a rifle. Okay, so let's say they get to that point. Still, though, there may not be that many of these available for them to buy. Another thing is vendors. Because of gun control, there aren't nearly as many vendors in Europe. So you have a much more limited option set. And you know what? There's going to be less supply because there's, of course, there's less demand also. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. But we also have to look at imports and specifically exports from Finland. Because this gun mostly was exported to North America and, Canada. Now, it did go to other places. Now, I had a viewer send me an email in Poland showing me an M39 they procured in Poland. There are M39s out there, especially in Europe, but to the same degree they are in America, not so much. So even though a gun may have very low or very high production numbers, depending on the geography of where you are, the rarity, and when I say rarity, really what I'm referring to is supply, of the current rifle that we're talking about may not necessarily be directly correlated with the production numbers of a rifle. Okay, hopefully you're with me so far. But one thing we've determined here is that rarity is a really tricky issue. But the thing I always harp on and go back to is production numbers. That's at least where we have to start, okay? Now, there are some Mosins where they made a lot of them, but there's a very, 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 very tiny portion of those that still exist. Now, a good example of that would be, say, a 1907 carbine, where they theoretically made hundreds of thousands of those rifles, but there's probably less than 50 known to exist now. Something like that, on the order of. I know there's going to be people that have different ideas on that, and that's fine, but in the ballpark, there's really not that many. And when we look at how many were made, it's like less than 1% still exists. Very, very tiny amount. So there are some things like that. And that's where we have to look at production numbers as sort of just a jumping off point. We have to start there and say, okay, well, how many were made? But then also how many are still around? Like, what is the current market supply of this particular gun? Now, if we look at the 37 million Mosins, or even just the 9130 rifle, because they made millions of 9130 rifles, if we compare that to the M39, where they only made, like, say, tens of thousands of these, could you say this is a rare rifle? Maybe. Maybe that would be fair. But this is where there's a nuance. Okay. When someone calls an M39 like this rare, they're probably not going to also say in the title of their gunbroker posting, in comparison to a 9130 rifle that's normally refurbished, it was imported from the Ukraine in the 1980s. Okay, they're probably not going to say that. Now, maybe that's what they mean, and that's fair to say because they are correct. In comparison, but that's a relative rarism. We're not necessarily talking about an absolute rarity. To me, an absolute rarity is something that I cannot get. Something that I may have to wait years to even find one that I could possibly get. Okay, well, if we start there, that's definitely not this particular rifle. So hopefully that gives y'all kind of a good idea of where my mindset is in this. And again, people are going to have their own opinions, and that's fine. But it's important to always remember there is an absolute truth, and then people are still going to have different opinions on what truth actually is, and in this case, what rarity is or isn't. There's absolute rarity from a production numbers, there's absolute rarity of how many are available, and there's relative rarity. It depends on also. This is a really complicated topic, folks, and we could make so many videos talking about rarity. But you can see why I get on a soapbox when we talk about rarity, because there aren't really that many Mosins that fit into my definition of rarity, of absolute rarity, where we're not comparing it to something else. Remember, Big Sam's definition of rarity is something that I just can't go out and buy right now. Like, there's none out there. I may have to wait a year, 2, 3 years for something to come around. That's rare. Okay, but there's still got to be a line somewhere. Like, where's the line, right? I mean, it could be a little more common than that, right? Maybe if I had to wait 1 year or 8 months to find one, could that still be rare? I don't know. See, this is where we're going to have our differences of opinion on this. And everyone's going to draw their line for absolute rarity in a different place. And this is also one of my gripes with the Mosin rarity table on 762x54r.net, if you've ever looked at that before. Now, don't get me wrong. It's a very useful table, and most of the information there is pretty good. But there are some problems with it, and we'll have to talk about that in another forum. This is not the forum to rant about that table or that website. And trust me, there's a lot of rants we can have about it. But it goes on a rarity scale of 1 to 10. Okay, well, that's very helpful in sort of the more, I guess, novice Mosin enthusiast trying to just get a grips on which models or years should I be interested in or looking for, or what are the ones that are going to be harder to find, potentially cost more money. Okay, well, that's good, but the problem is their scale only goes from 1 to 10, where 1 is least rare, 10 is most rare. Now, some of the guns in there they actually have several guns in there listed as 10 in rarity. And some of them are not listed as 10 and should be. Some of them are listed as 10 and maybe shouldn't be. But the problem is it caps out at 10. All right? So if I say there's 10 different guns and they're all, like, one of them's rare, like a 10 rarity, like one of them, I may have to wait a year for one to come up for sale. One will come up for sale every year. Okay, that'll be a 10. But then there may be another one where, the last one that came up for sale was 15 years ago, and there's probably only like 10 known to exist. If those get both classified as a 10, that really doesn't tell us that much, does it? So that's another problem of rarity is, where do we draw the line, but also where does it cap out? Because if you put the ceiling somewhere, there's always going to be some weird maker, model, or variant that has this crazy story that's always going to go way higher than that. And it's a little bit unfair to have a cap somewhere at some arbitrarily or artificially low number. Okay, now we're kind of gone off topic a little bit talking about rarity of Mosins in general, but what about Finnish Mosins? Okay, well, let's say somebody says a Finnish Mosin is rare. Just an absolute statement like that. Well, I would say that is not true. But, again, there needs to be more context to really answer that question. Context is everything. If you're in, I don't know, let's say Brazil, for instance. Are Finnish Mosins rare in Brazil? My guess is probably very, very rare. Are Finnish Mosins rare in Antarctica? I would hope so. Unless there's some strategic Antarctic supply of Finnish Mosins that we're not aware of, they're probably pretty rare in Antarctica. I don't know if any Finnish Mosins have been to Antarctica even, but that'll have to be a topic for another time. Might be an interesting one, though, so you have to remind me. But, again, people are going to have different experiences based on their geography and the current available supply. This is an important one, folks, the current available supply. Finnish Mosins could be a dime a dozen on, say, Gunbroker. There's basically never been a time since I was interested in Mosins that I went on Gunbroker and I couldn't find a Finnish Mosin. There's enough supply here in the United States because so many of them were imported, even though if we compare it to like a 9130 rifle that the Russians made, they didn't make nearly as many of them, just a small fraction. So many of the portion that were created were imported here into the United States, so you can find them, right? So on an absolute scale, I would say, generally speaking, Finnish Mosins aren't rare, unless you're in like Brazil or Antarctica or someplace. If you're here in America, they're not that rare. Okay, now, there are some different models, though, and here in America, that are extremely rare. Yes, if I'm calling it rare on an absolute scale, trust me, folks, they're rare. An example would be an M39 configured to a sniper variant by Finland during the Continuation War, That is an extremely rare gun. Now, of course, those, because they're so rare, they're kind of hard to authenticate, and you have to worry about fakes and stuff like that. But let's say you had a real one. That is a very rare gun. There are variants of Finnish Mosins that are extremely rare. Here, this M39, though, maybe if this had a straight stock, would that be rare? Well, they made straight stocks very early on in around 1941, and I've seen some of them. So, could I go out and buy one right now? Probably not. I would have to wait a while for one to come up for sale. So, it's not common by any stretch of the imagination, but on an absolute scale, they're not quite up to where I would say they're rare, okay? And if we say rare again is a general, like a cap, like that 10 out of 10 rarity scale, it wouldn't really be fair to associate a straight stocked M39 like this with the same terminology that it would to associate it with a M39, an original sniper variant M39, right? So it's really unfair to associate those with the same context because they're just not. I mean, one's not very common, and one's like crazy rare all the way up here. So the term rare or very rare in all caps, that's my favorite one when somebody does that. We've used it so much, though, that it's sort of meaningless at this point, at least in the context of Mosins. That's why I want to put this out there to help us just reset our minds a little bit on, okay, what is actually rare? What is uncommon? What is rare for a certain place or a certain time, right? And I mean, even some that are extremely rare are still going to be extremely rare in places where you might have ready access to them, like here in America. So chances are, if it's really rare here in America, it's going to be extremely rare over in Europe. But that's not always the case. In fact, there are some Mosins where you might actually have an easier time finding one over in Europe than over here in America. But we'll have to talk about those in another day. Just another example to show, though, that the term rare is something I'm very hesitant to use in the context of Mosins. Okay, so this is an M39 rifle. We've already established that this, here in America, is not a rare rifle. Is it uncommon? Perhaps. I think that might be a fair term. But again, that's another thing where we're going to have a difference of opinion on what uncommon means. And, well, maybe that'll be another video, is what does uncommon Mosins mean? Oh, boy. This is like a never-ending rabbit hole, folks. So I'm trying not to go too crazy on this. But let's take a look at another Finnish Mosin, and then we'll talk about its rarity now. All right, so here we've got a French contract 1894 M91 long rifle. As you can see, this is a really long rifle. Again, produced in 1894, so this is an old varmint here. And it's a Finnish Mosin. Now, remember, we had another video on what is a Finnish Mosin. This one was obviously not built by Finland. This was built in France. But somehow Finland got a hold of this rifle, stamped their army property marking on it, and used it in their military. So it's sort of a Finnish Mosin by proxy, if that's how you want to call it, or a true Finnish Mosin, but it is a Finnish Mosin nonetheless. Now, when we talk about a rarity of a rifle like this gets a little bit more interesting because these guns, the French contract rifles, are much less common than we would say like the M39 rifles. Now, I would say here in America, again, these are going to be the most, it's going to be the easiest place to find a French contract M91. But when we talk about Europe, these rifles, well, they get actually a lot rarer. A lot rarer. In fact, in Russia, who use these rifles, these guns are pretty much non-existent. Maybe in a few museums. I don't know if I think the Tula Museum has at least one or two of these rifles. Obviously, they weren't finished. They were before that, so they're very interesting. But beyond that, you know, if you wanted to go out and buy one of these in Europe, you might be out of luck. If you can find a good one, let me know. Or if you have one and you're in Europe, let me know. But they seem to be extremely rare. So much so that I was reading some of the documentation for the Châtellerault factory's actual museum, because this factory, the building, is still around. They still have a museum. And they're stating one of the few rifles that they produce that they don't even have in their collection is this, the French contract M91 Mosin Nagant. So if the Châtellerault factory museum in France cannot get a hold of one of these, That probably means it's not that easy to come by around those parts. Now, here in America, we fare a little bit better. Again, these are much less common than, say, that M39 we just looked at. But if you look around, you'll find one of these come up for sale. I mean, you may see a few of them come up for sale a year. Maybe 5, probably not even 10. At least on like the internet. If you go to like a gun store, gun shop, you're probably not going to see one of these. If you're really lucky, you might, but this is not something I would expect to find. An M39, you can find those at, your local gun store if you look hard enough. These, probably not as much. You're much less likely to find one of these. Now, how many of these were made? Well, the Châtellerault contract was roughly around 500,000 rifles. Now, that may sound like a lot, and, well, you're right, but then again, what is absolutely a lot? That's what I was trying to get at. Well, your definition of a lot might be different from my definition of a lot. Now, there also may be an absolute definition of a lot, but I don't think there really is. This is where it gets nuanced, folks. And again, it's really easy to go down a rabbit hole of, well, what does that actually mean? And your opinion's different than mine. A lot. Well, in the context of Mosins, 500,000 may not actually be that much because they made 37 million, right? This is only 500,000. Okay, maybe it's just a drop in the bucket for like a 9130. But if we look at some other stuff, well, I'd say it's probably a lot. 500,000 rifles is nothing to sneeze at. Chances are you've probably never been around 500,000 rifles at the same time in your life. That's because it would be really hard to fit one of these in your house or your basement or even your local Walmart. Although I would really like to see that. So if you have seen that before, let me know. But 500,000 rifles is kind of a lot. So why are these so uncommon today? Well, part of that goes back to Imperial Russia and the fact that a lot of these were lost during the Russo-Japanese War, that's what I was looking for, of 1904. Now, 1904 was a long time ago, and a lot of these guns, these were basically some of the first Mosins to be produced because the Châtellerault factory was able to start mass production of these before the Russian factories were. So these guys really got out to the troops before most of the other guys did. And these were heavily used in the Russo-Japanese War. Well, if y'all are familiar with it, I know we haven't really talked about it yet. We will on this channel, don't worry. But that didn't really go so well for the Russians. They had a lot of casualties. And it was sort of just a horrible experience in general for them. And it was not good, folks. So a lot of these guns were lost as a result of that war. But there's another problem. And that problem is these guns, to be around today, had to survive the Russo-Japanese War. They had to survive all the conflicts after that, the Balkan campaigns in the early 19 teens. Obviously, World War I and all of its spin-off conflicts with other countries starting in 1918 and thereafter, including the Russian Civil War, and you get this huge mess in all of Europe, both east and some of it to the west as well, because Poland really had a fun time fighting the Soviets as well as Ukraine after World War I. But there's a lot of bad places that these rifles had to survive or go through. And of course, the elephant in the room is had to survive World War II after all of that. So after all of that, if we look at how many of those initial 500,000 rifles survived, it's not that many. Now, do we have a good estimate of how many are left? I currently don't, but it's something I would like to work on because I think we probably could get a relatively decent approximation if we really tried hard enough. But these rifles are not that easy to come by. Now, let's go back to our conversation about Finland, because that's really what this video pertains to today, is Finland. When we look at a Finnish M91, or excuse me, a French-produced M91 rifle like this, there's going to be approximately a 95 to 99% chance that it's a Finnish Mosin. Why is that? Well, part of that is going back to what we already stated before. A lot of these rifles were simply lost in the early days of the 20th century. So by the time that Finland gained its independence, and around 1919 when it started looking around at what rifle to standardize on, it was looking at Mosins. And of course, we know that Finland grabbed all sorts of Mosins up from the vaults of European arsenals throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. And so a lot of the remaining M91 rifles, like the French contract Russian M91s, kind of made it to Finland. They did a lot of horse trading around for goods in order to procure those rifles. So some of these rifles were already in Finland, okay? Because if y'all remember, before the Finnish Civil War, Finland was actually part of Russia. And so you'd have like Russian troops. It's kind of weird because the Tsar acted as like the Grand Duke of Finland, and you'd actually have like Russian troops in Finland, but some of them were Russian and some of them were Finnish, but they were Russian, but they were Finnish. It's kind of weird. But during World War I, like in 1915, let's say, there wasn't that much fighting in Finland itself, but they still had troops stationed there as well as weapon depots stationed there. Now, how many of those weapons were moved out of there and moved into units closer to the front, I don't know. But one thing we do know is that when the Finnish Civil War started, their troops raided a lot of the current Russian armories, the weapon armories there, where they produced a lot of M91 rifles and even some old Berdan rifles. But we know that some of these were probably just like laying around in Finland, kind of sitting idle during World War I. That's kind of interesting. But also you have to think, well, there's a lot of places in World War I, even though how badly they tried to get all these to the front, where guns like this were sort of just sitting idle. Because, let's face it, as much as you want to try to get all of your good weapons up to the front for your fighting troops, and I say the term good loosely because this is probably like the poorest bolt action of the war, but for the Russians this was good because this was gun and gun worked, at least by their definitions. But the problem is the Russian Empire was so vast and so corrupt and poorly mismanaged that, I mean, there's a lot of guns that were just at your corners of your empire that are just bound to get overlooked when you're trying to scope out problems like that. And they were. And maybe this rifle was one of those. We don't really know. It certainly was used. It's very counterboard. It's got a lot of pitting on it. Kind of an interesting piece of history. So we don't know exactly where this gun was before 1941. But this, of course, was used by Finland because it's got their army stamping right here on it. This SA in a box. Okay, but why does that matter? Well, all of these guns, most of all these guns, were bought up by Finland. But here's the thing. There's not many of these that aren't Finnish, right? And it's kind of boggles the mind to think about it. Like, this is a pretty rare gun, sort of a rare gun, but who's rare are we talking about? Well, if we talk about Big Sam's rare, I wouldn't quite call this rare here in America. I would say it's close, but it's not quite rare. This is definitely up there on Mosins that are hard to get. But it's not really near the very top of the list. But it's close-ish, okay? Maybe that'll give you an understanding of how I feel about the rarity of this gun. Now, most of these, again, are in 1894 patterns. They produced these from 1892 to 1895, and you'll see that those different dates and that range stamped on them. Most of them are 1894. And all of them, though, that I've seen almost, are from Finland. So it does seem that, honestly, a lot more of these were lost in the Russo-Japanese War than I think we realize. And I've read that from Russians and Russian sources that say, yeah, a lot of these were lost in the Russo-Japanese War. And it kind of makes sense because, again, in Russia, there aren't really any of these guns left that were actually used in battle. I think the ones in museums probably weren't even used in battle. Unlike this guy, who definitely used in some really horrible battles. So, if we couple that with the fact that, today, after all the Mosins are imported here in America, we don't really see any M91 rifles from the French contract that aren't from Finland. Kind of tells us that even by the time Finland was ramping up and in the 1930s, they didn't really have that many of these rifles. Probably. Yeah, and how many is a lot? Well, I've seen a fair amount of these guns. I mean, I've definitely seen probably like 20 or 30 of these rifles, these French contract rifles, but I've also seen a lot of them where a lot of their receivers were rebarreled. So the receivers Finland used, but then they get rebarreled. So the problem is when that happens, it's actually you have to disassemble the gun to figure out if the receiver is a French one or not. So it's kind of hard to tell if that gun is actually a French Mosin, and that's going to make that run where we take a look at how many French Mosins did Finland actually have and how many still exist. It's hard to tell, kind of, because some of the receivers are still around, but they're rebarreled. So how do we classify that? Do we classify that as a French Mosin, or we only classify it as complete guns? Okay. There's a lot of ranting going on in this video, so I appreciate y'all bearing with me. But the main reason I want to talk about this rifle here today, again, because most of these are, almost all of these are Finnish Mosins. When we say Finnish Mosins are rare, that's really, it's a double-edged sword for something like this, because I think by most people's definition, this actually is a rare rifle. Even though it may not totally fit with my definition of rare rifle, I think most people would say, yeah, this is a rare rifle. But I have to balance that also with the fact that all of these basically are Finnish. So if you had one of these that aren't Finnish, that would be really crazy and extremely interesting. That would be rare. Okay. So is it fair to say that this gun is not rare? Not really. We'd have to say with this explicit clause, in comparison to French contract rifles that aren't from Finland, this is not a rare rifle. Okay. But on an absolute scale, it's pretty close. It's kind of rare. So the fact that this rifle's Finnish actually makes it much less rare than it would if it didn't have the Finnish stamp. But that's kind of interesting because how many guns are there where a stamp makes it rare? A lot. But there's not as many guns, I feel like, where it not having a stamp makes it rare. It's a lot harder to fake a gun by removing a stamp than it is to add one, in my opinion. But, well, that's another topic for another day. Okay, but hopefully this gives you another good idea of what we're talking about with Finnish Mosins. It really depends. If this was a different manufacturer, if this was a Tula from 1894, would this be rare? It wouldn't be as rare as this rifle for sure, because there are definitely more Tulas out there. But really, any Mosin from 1894, I mean, that's pretty old. Yeah, that's not super common. Okay, so we looked at this guy. Let's get this guy out of the way and let's look at one more rifle, because I think you're going to like this one. Alright, so here's one more interesting gun we're going to look at. And I know a lot of people are probably going to be mad that we haven't spent a lot of time looking at the markings on the previous rifles. Well, I understand that, but there's two caveats I would say. Caveat number one is we've already spent a lot of time looking at those rifles in previous videos. So if you're interested in looking more of those again, I would suggest looking at some of our previous videos. And also, we'll be looking at those again in future videos, so stay tuned. Point number two is the main form of this video is to discuss rarity in general, not specifically looking at markings, but in this case, we'll actually looking at the markings on this guy because they will help us determine rarity. Okay, so let me bring the camera around and we'll take a look at this rascal. So what do we have here? Well, this guy is a Finnish Mosin. Specifically, this is an M27 rifle. Now, are these rare? I would say no. Generally speaking, M27s are not rare here in America. They are not common, but you can find them. They're maybe a little less common than the M39s, but they're kind of in the same realm. This guy, though, is a little bit of a different animal. And that's because if we look at the markings here, we'll see this particular one was produced by the VKT Arsenal, aka Valmet, in 1935. Now, why is that particular manufacturer and date of production important on this rifle? Well, that's important because, let me sit this guy down here. That's important because, remember, going back to our absolutism of production numbers, they actually only produced 350 of these rifles in 1935. So if we looked at just that, we would say, okay, 350 out of the 37 million that were produced, this is a rare rifle. And I would actually agree with that. I think this kind of comes to the point where we would say this is a rare rifle. But we also have to look at how many are around today. And even though they only made 350 of these, there's still a small portion of that are still around today that are known to exist. Again, there could be a bunch of these. There could be 100 or 200 of these sitting around in some warehouse in Finland or even Montana right now for all we know. But of the 350 that exist, not that many are left that we know about. It's probably around or less than 10% of that are still known to exist. So not a very common rifle, folks. Okay, I like to look at this last because this really helps to show the spectrum, where you start out at something like an M39 or even like a Finnish captured 9130, kind of a normal gun. Now, it's going to be less common than just your standard Russian refurbished 9130 rifle. But, you know, you can get them, right? You can get them, right? And the same goes generally for most M27 rifles as well. Then we get to a little bit higher, like those Russian contract French Mosins. Okay, well, those are getting up there. Those are not very common. And then you could even get ones like this, or a sniper variant that are just off the charts, you know. You're probably not going to find one of these. Or I think there's actually one of these on Gunbroker right now. So there may be one you can go get if you want to snatch it up. Okay. Not very many of these known to exist, though. So there's a huge spectrum, okay, from sort of common, but that you can get it to that you're probably not even going to find one, right? And the problem is with Finnish Mosins, the spectrum is so large that saying absolutism, saying a Finnish Mosin is rare, is a fallacy. That is an incorrect statement. We need more context. Which Finnish Mosin are we talking about? How are you defining rare? Are you saying production numbers? Are you saying available where you live? Because again, maybe if you live in Thailand, Finnish M27s aren't going to be very common there. That may very well be the truth. So again, that helps us demonstrate why we need a little bit more context. When we go out and spout off things, we just say something's rare. If we don't have a context about why it's rare, why do you think it's rare, or what basis are you saying that it's rare, we get to the point where we are today where everybody and their brother's pet monkey's cousin's second uncle twice removed says, oh, this is a Finnish Mosin, this is a rare gun. You know, okay. Well, a lot of people say that, but we need to just drill down into the details a little bit more, figure out exactly what we're looking at, and figure out exactly what you mean by rare, right? Because again, if somebody says rare, they could be honestly saying something that's true, even though it may not be an agreement with what I think is rare on a global scale. An absolutism. What is absolutely rare as far as production numbers or as far as how many are there around? The problem with that one, though, again, there's really no set definition in Webster's dictionary of what is rare for a Mosin. So that's why it helps us to be able to define our terms a little better and to understand in what context are we talking about. And unfortunately, when a lot of people will just say, oh, that's rare, we don't have that context. And that's one of the reasons I get a little bit worked up about it is, well, that's not rare because, well, they made, 50,000 of those, and I've seen 3 of those already this year. That's not rare. Now, to some people, that may be rare, though, right? Because maybe you're used to looking at AR-15s, where maybe, you can go into any gun store in America and you can buy an AR-15. Okay, that's not rare. But maybe you're interested in a Mosin, or a Finnish Mosin in particular, and you go to 100 gun stores before you even find one, and you think, well, maybe this is a rare gun. Man, it took me a really long time just to find one of these. So you might have that context to judge your definition of what rare is. That's fine. I get that. But I also have to balance that with the fact that guns like this aren't if you want to go to like gun stores or pawn shops to find something like that, that's not the forum to do that. For collectors' guns, generally here in America, what you want to do is go online to a place like Gunbroker or even Arms List to some degree. But that's going to be the first place you want to start for something like this. But when we get into really obscure guns, that's when you really have to start looking at auction companies, and not Gunbroker. I mean, like actual auction companies where, people that go there dress really nicely. They don't look like me. They wear like suits and they smell nice, also unlike me. Probably a place I'm not very welcome, which is actually where this particular rifle came from. Now, you can bid on those online, thankfully, so you don't have to go and wear a suit and show up in person or anything like that. But that's generally the best place to find one of these. So there could be on Gunbroker 5 M27s right now for sale at the same time. But in parallel, you've been shopping for the last 2 years, and all you've been doing is going to gun stores, and you've only ever seen one in 2 years. Well, you're going to have a different opinion of rarity than me just off of that. That's why context can make a big difference, folks. Okay, so what have we learned here today? Well, one, we live in a postmodernist society where there is no truth, unfortunately. There is only madness. The best way of analogy I can think of is a Parks and Recreation episode where Ron Swanson had a child, And he said he appreciated silence so much. But unfortunately in his life, silence had been replaced by the TV program Doc McStuffins. And in Ron Swanson's terms, he says, "There is no silence. There is only Doc McStuffins." That's kind of the society we live in, where everyone has their own opinion on what truth is. And there's a lot of problems with that from, a political level or a moral level, especially moral level. Because remember, the only absolute truth is Jesus Christ. And when we start deviating from that, that's where we get all these moral problems. But for this video, when we talk about things like rarity and whose definition of rarity is correct, well, we don't have a biblical definition of rarity. We all are going to have our own opinions of rarity. Now, here on the channel, I'm very careful. I try to be, some of y'all might disagree, but I try to be careful about using the term rare to describe Mosins, because we used it so much that I feel like it's become meaningless. It's kind of like the term racism. Have you ever heard racism used recently in some context or another? Racism, unfortunately, it's a horrible thing, but it's just thrown out there so much and used to describe things that aren't really racist and things that people need to get over, that it really dilutes real racial problems that exist today. And it's sort of the same thing, although Mosins aren't nearly as important as solving racism or anything like that. But what I will say is I try to be careful about terms I use, because words do mean things. And if all we do is use the same words over and over, they tend to stop losing their meaning. I mean, how many times have you spent in your life where you just said a word over and over and over and over and over and over again until you realize that you don't even understand what you're saying and it has no meaning anymore? Maybe some of y'all know what I'm getting at. Okay, so it helps to understand where each person's coming from. And right, somebody might come to me and say, "Big Sam from Australia, these are really rare rifles." And I might say, "Well, that's weird, because there's 5 of them on Gunbroker right now. Except, oh, you're in Australia and there aren't really any for sale." Or maybe you're in America, but you're not looking in the right place, right? And so you really have to have a conversation. And this is something we don't, unfortunately, really have in this country, because people are so polarized and so divided about everything. It's really good to just sit down like we are right now in an honest forum and have an honest conversation to figure out exactly what you mean and what I'm talking about, so we can kind of get on the same page and understand each other a little better. Even if we don't agree, we don't have to agree on everything, folks, okay? We're not going to agree on everything. That's just the way God made us. Everyone's a little bit different. If we were all the same and we agreed on everything, this would be a pretty boring world. But having a conversation is important, and it's something I strongly urge all of y'all to do as well in your personal and social lives. Okay, so before we go too far down any more rabbit holes, we should probably end the video, because this has already gone on for longer than it should have, probably. And if we spend all the time looking at the cool markings and the 2-piece stock, this would be like a 3-hour video, and nobody really has the patience for that, and I understand that. So thank you guys for watching. If you like more Mosin Nagant content like this, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.